I picked up a cognitive science minor. I don't know if you have the time to finish it. I'm taking a commission with Dr. Musolino right now. So.
Excellent,
Okay, I want to welcome everyone out here this evening for our program about the immaterial soul. I'm Matt Matsuda. I'm faculty here at Rutgers in the history department, and we're very pleased to be able to host. I'm also the academic dean here at the Honors College. I do live here at the Honors College, which is a living learning facility for the entire university and for our community. There are currently 500 first-year students living just directly above us in the residence hall, and the rest of the facility is devoted exactly to interdisciplinary engagements across the entire academic community. So as we have some more of our colleagues come in, we just want to thank especially our fearless leader here, Sarah Pixley from the Center for Cognitive Studies, Cognitive Science, who is leading and put together this terrific program with our colleagues, I believe, from philosophy, from cognitive science, from religion, some from history. And it's a great example of the cooperation of the university and of the larger scholarly community around issues that are of great interest to everyone. So, and for our host here, Sarah Pixley.
Thank you all for being here. I just want to echo the sentiment. Thank you for the Honors College for letting us host this great space and getting you all involved. Also, the Cognitive Science Club and Philosophy Club, they really helped to get folks interested in this. And yeah, so it's great to have you all here. I wanted to introduce myself. Yeah, so Sarah Pixley. I'm the Executive Staff Director of the Center for Cognitive Science. Can you all hear me okay? Do I have to yell really loud? I have a soft voice. Okay. Good thing I'm not doing this the whole time. So who here is familiar with the Center for Cognitive Science? Yeah. Hopefully you guys.
Yeah, right.
So just to tell you a little bit about the center, we are an interdisciplinary center where it's the intersection of philosophy, computer science, psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, all to study the mind. And we really, it's one of the great places where you can kind of bridge the arts and the sciences in your research. And this is just, a little tidbit of the kind of events that we're going to be putting on throughout the year. This is maybe part one of maybe we'll have ones on artificial intelligence in the future. We'll be putting those together and keeping you all informed. So the format of this, for the first hour, we are going to have some really great background to this age-old question, do we have a soul? Brian's going to provide some really great background there. And then we're going to have arguments for and against. And then also, rather than having them spar, there's no ring here, we're actually going to put out to you guys to be involved in the dialogue, ask questions. This should be really kind of lively, and please feel free once that first hour is up to ask questions. There's no bad questions. This will be a really great dialogue that we have. So I want to introduce really quickly just who the speakers are going to be, and then we'll just go ahead and get started. So first, we have Brian McLaughlin, who's a distinguished professor at Rutgers University. He holds dual appointments in philosophy and the Center for Cognitive Science, where he's also currently serving as the director. He works on various metaphysical problems concerning the mind, and he will be providing really the background or the backbone for this argument tonight. Julien Musolino, he's a public speaker, author, also a professor at Rutgers University, where he also holds dual appointments in psychology and Center for Cognitive Science as well. He's the author of many scientific articles, and more recently, the popular science book, The Soul Fallacy. So he's written a book on this topic we're going to be discussing today. And he will be arguing against the existence of the immaterial soul. Now we have Mark Baker, who's also a distinguished professor at Rutgers, where he also holds dual appointments in linguistics and the Center for Cognitive Science. See the theme here, very interdisciplinary. And there he works on comparative syntax, linguistics, and semantic roles. Mark will be arguing against the existence of an immaterial soul. He also was an author on a book.
Four.
4, sorry, did I say?
Otherwise, there's
Oh,
no
otherwise,
debate.
I'm sorry, apologies, I'm changing the narrative here. He's also the author of the soul hypothesis as well. So without further ado, let's get Brian started on this. So
Well, thank you,
guys.
Sarah. And thanks to Dean Huda and the Honors College for letting us use this wonderful space. Thank all of you for coming. What I'm going to do is just sit here and read what's on the screen so I can stay in control of time. You don't want to get me talking extemporaneously. You'll be very sorry. So. I'll begin tonight with a reading from Genesis 3:19. After the transgression in the Garden of Eden, God reminded Adam, "Dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return." Modern science concurs. It tells us that we're composed of dust, of stardust, atoms formed in the nuclear cores of stars. Our bodies, including our brains, are wholly composed of cells, which are wholly composed of molecules, which are wholly composed of atoms, which in turn are wholly composed of more fundamental physical particles. They're wholly made up of dust. But could we ourselves be wholly composed of dust? We think and feel, we reason, perceive, imagine, feel bodily sensations, experience moods and emotions. How could a system of physical dust, no matter how complexly organized, be or wholly make up a thinking, feeling being? We're conscious. Objects experience acceleration and the like, but we have subjective experiences, experiences that are like something for us as subjects. It's like something for us when, for instance, we see the scene before our eyes, or when we feel pain. We have subjectivity. How could a system of dust, no matter how complexly organized, be conscious? How could a conscious being, a subjective experience, just consist in a system of dust? How could a material system, wholly made up of atoms and more fundamental physical particles, have subjectivity? To put it as Jean-Paul Sartre would, how can an en soi be a pour soi? A venerable philosophical tradition tells us that we are not wholly materially constituted. That in addition to having material parts, we also have an immaterial mind or soul. The tradition traces back at least to Plato. In Plato's dialogue, Phaedo, Socrates is surrounded by his followers and faces his impending death by hemlock, a sentence imposed by an Athenian court after he was found guilty of the crime of corrupting the young. Socrates informs his followers that he doesn't fear bodily death because he has an immortal soul. One of Socrates' arguments for the immortality of the soul is that the soul is immaterial, not made of material parts, and so cannot cease to exist by coming apart. The argument is inconclusive. Even if the soul is immaterial, might it not cease to exist all at once? Whether we have an immaterial soul is one question, whether it's immortal is another. Not everyone in antiquity was convinced that we have an immaterial soul. Lucretius, working under the assumption that the forces of nature are contact forces, so that for one thing to directly exert a force on another, the two things must be in physical contact, stated, "Reasoning proves the nature of the mind and spirit to be corporeal, for when it seemed to hurl the limbs forward, to snatch the body out of sleep, to alter the face, and to govern and steer the entire man, and we see none of these is possible without touch, nor touch without body," he means physical contact, "you must surely admit that mind and spirit are constituted with a corporeal nature." The idea that we have an immaterial soul is nowhere to be found in the Torah or Old Testament. nor is it to be found in the New Testament. The New Testament tells us that eternal life is to be achieved through the resurrection of the body, with the soul in a glorified state, with the body in a glorified state, freed from suffering and pain. The idea of an immaterial soul seems to have entered Christian theology through the work of Augustine, an African philosopher who was the bishop of Hippo. Augustine was a Platonist philosopher schooled in Rome who converted to Christianity while teaching in Milan at age 31. If we indeed have an immaterial soul, how is it related to our material bodies? In answer to that question, Augustine tells us, quote, "The manner in which spirits are united to bodies is altogether wonderful and transcends the understanding of men." To use a term sometimes used in contemporary cognitive science, the idea is that we are cognitively closed to the relationship between souls and bodies. That is to say, we're constitutionally unable to form the concepts necessary to understand how they're related. Compare the fact that a cat, for instance, is cognitively closed to the mathematical relation of being the square root of 16. A cat can't form the concept of a square root or even of the number 16. It thus lacks the mental capacity to grasp the relation. The idea is that we are in the same position as concerns the relationships between souls and bodies. If Augustine is right, then the relation will forever remain a mystery to us because understanding it will forever remain beyond our conceptual grasp. The relation transcends human understanding. Perhaps it does. It seems an unjustified arrogance to think that there's nothing that transcends our understanding. But perhaps the relation in question doesn't transcend our understanding. Many thinkers have not been content just to accept such a mystery, but have instead sought understanding. René Descartes recognized that the brain is a physical organ that's intimately related to the mind. Aristotle, for instance, didn't recognize that there was a connection between mind and brain. Descartes preferred to speak of the mind rather than of the soul and address the issue of how the mind is related to the brain. With Descartes, the soul-body problem became the mind-brain problem, though today it still goes under the name the mind-body problem. Descartes maintained that the mind is wholly immaterial, and so is neither the brain nor any physical part of the brain, or indeed anything physical. He thus held that mind and brain are entirely distinct things. They're not identical, and neither is part of the other. This view is known as Cartesian substance dualism. There are minds and there are brains, and they are entirely distinct. Descartes thus faced the problem of how our immaterial minds or souls are related to our brains. He maintained that they are causally related as causes and effects. Mental states and events cause certain brain states and events, and certain brain states and events cause mental states and events. The notion of causation here is the familiar one we have in mind when we say such things as the short circuit caused the fire, the ice on the wings of the plane caused the plane to crash, and my flipping the switch caused the light to come on. David Hume later called causation the cement of the universe, since it is what holds things together, as well, of course, as what breaks things apart. Descartes claims that it is what unites minds and brains. He held more specifically that states of mind, both directly and fundamentally, causally interact with states of the pineal gland, a small endocrine gland within the brain. Neuroscience has shown us that he was mistaken in thinking that the pineal gland is a locus of mind-brain interaction. But we can replace talk of the pineal gland with talk of whatever part of the brain is in fact relevant to mentality, a matter of ongoing research. The crucial point is that the mind-brain causal transactions in question are supposed to be direct and fundamental. To understand the notion of directness, consider its opposite, indirectness. Think of a causal chain or process that initiates with a domino falling, which causes another domino to fall, which causes, in turn, yet another domino to fall, with the last domino falling as a result of the fall of the one just before it. The fall of the first domino is one of the causes of the fall of the last domino via or by means of an intermediary causal chain of domino fallings. Causation is a transitive relation. If A causes B and B causes C, then A causes C. The first fall thus indirectly causes the last fall. It causes it, but by first causing something else. On Descartes' view, certain mental brain causal interactions are not indirect, but rather direct. They are not mediated by any intermediary chain or process of states and events. On his view, certain mind-brain causal interactions are also fundamental in that there is no underlying causal mechanism by means of which they occur. Contrast that with the fact that there is, for instance, an underlying causal mechanism by which striking a match causes a flame, a mechanism that was not understood until the late 19th century. His view is not that we do not yet know what the underlying mechanism is in mind-brain causal interactions. It is that there is no underlying mechanism. Since there is no underlying mechanism or intermediary causal chain in the mind-brain cases in question, there is no answer to the question, how do mental states causally interact with the brain states in question? There is no answer because psychophysical causal interactions are direct and rock bottom. The view that mind-brain causal transactions are direct and fundamental is called Cartesian interactionism. For Descartes, what it is for something to be physical is for it to be located in space. He held that the mind is immaterial in that although it is in time, it isn't in space. On his view, minds have no spatial location. This poses a problem of squaring Cartesian substance dualism with Cartesian interactionism. It's deeply puzzling how states of and changes in something that is supposed not to be in space, a mind, could causally influence something that is in space, a brain or material part of a brain. Moreover, this poses an insuperable problem for Descartes' own worldview, since, like Lucretius, he held that forces in nature are contact forces. The problem, in a nutshell, is that no spatial contact can be made between something that is in space and something that is not in space. They can't touch. Independently thinking along the same lines as Lucretius, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia wrote the following in a letter to Descartes. I admit that it would be easier for me to concede matter and extension in space to the mind than it would be for me to concede the capacity to move a body and be moved by a body to an immaterial thing. Descartes responded to her in a way reminiscent of Augustine. It does not seem to me that the human mind is capable of conceiving quite distinctly and at the same time both the distinction between mind and body and their union. The idea seems to be that the union between mind and body transcends human understanding, that we're cognitively closed to it. Since Isaac Newton physicists have eschewed the notion of contact forces. Newton maintained that causal action at a distance occurs when one body exerts a gravitational force on another body, not contiguous with it, or linked to it by a series of contiguous bodies. Despite the absence of a chain of continuous bodies linking the Earth and Moon nevertheless exert a gravitational force on each other. Still, two bodies must both be in space to exert a gravitational force on each other. The law of gravity tells us that the gravitational force two bodies exert on each other is directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Something outside of space isn't any distance at all from anything. Newton's causal action at a distance offers no comfort to Cartesian dualists. Contemporary physicists maintain that forces can be propagated through force fields. Force fields are not matter and needn't contain matter, not even a particle. But fields are in space-time and are physical, and mass energy is conserved in causal interactions. Recall Albert Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. The equation tells us that matter and energy are equivalent quantities. Any kind of force or energy that exerts a fundamental influence on motion is the business of physics, a science that includes mechanics, the theory of motion. Contemporary physicists make no appeal to vital or psychic energy or forces, such as the force of will. 20th century physicists appeal to only four fundamental forces: the gravitational force, the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, and the weak force. And they seek greater unification of the forces of nature, rather than anticipating the need to posit additional fundamental forces. The electromagnetic and weak force may have already been unified. Other advances in science have only exacerbated the tension between Cartesian dualism and Cartesian interactionism. Descartes tells us that minds are non-spatial, but nevertheless in time. According to Einstein's general theory of relativity, nothing can be in time without being in space. Pierre Laplace gave an elementary lecture to Napoleon on Newtonian mechanics. Although the story might be partly apocryphal, it's often claimed that after the lecture, Napoleon asked Laplace why he hadn't mentioned the author of the universe, God. Laplace replied, "I have no need of that hypothesis." Many science-minded thinkers today hold that they have no need of the hypothesis that there is an immaterial soul or mind. But whether we have need of an hypothesis depends on what it is we're trying to explain. It may well be the case that neuroscientists will find that whenever we're in a certain complex neural state, we have a certain kind of conscious experience. The question would remain what the relationship is between the complex neural state and the conscious experience. In 1869, Thomas Huxley remarked, "How is it that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the genie when Aladdin rubbed his lamp." We've made enormous progress since Huxley in determining what bits of nervous tissue must be irritated for an individual to have conscious experiences of various sorts. But many think that Huxley's mystery would remain even if neuroscientists discovered neural correlates of consciousness. We are conscious in that we have subjective experiences, and thus subjectivity. It's like something to be us. Science strives for an objective understanding of things. Would an objective understanding of subjectivity inevitably leave something out? How could subjectivity be located in an objective world? In 1925, Bertrand Russell stated, "It's obvious that a man who can see knows things which a blind man cannot know, but a blind man can know the whole of physics. Thus, the knowledge which other men have and he has not is not part of physics." One thing a sighted person knows is what it's like to see, to visually experience something. It seems that that can't be learned just by reading a physics textbook, either one now on the shelves or one yet to be written. To know what an experience is like, you had to have had it, or one similar to it. Experience itself is the only teacher. It doesn't seem to diminish the force of Russell's argument to include not just physics, but chemistry and biology, including molecular and computational neuroscience. Might then the objective book of the world inevitably leave some aspect of reality out? In 1949, Gilbert Ryle argued that it's a mistake to think of the mind as a kind of object that is somehow related to the brain. The mind, Ryle held, is not a kind of object, material or immaterial. To think otherwise, he claimed, is to be misled by the surface grammatical fact that mind is a noun. Personality is also a noun. You have a personality, you also have a car, but you don't have a personality in the same sense that you have a car, or in the same sense in which you have an arm or a leg. A personality is not any kind of object or subject. To think otherwise is to make what Ryle calls a category a mistake of identifying something of one category with something of a different category, where the categories are such that nothing could be in both. An example would be saying that generosity is redness. Redness is a color, generosity is a character trait. No character trait could be a color. To think otherwise is to make a category mistake. Ryle argued that to have a mind is not to possess some special kind of object, but just to have various capacities and abilities, such as the ability to think and the ability to feel. The brain is relevant to mentality in that it is the material seat of mental capacities and abilities. And so without a properly functioning brain, we would lack these capacities. But the mind is not the brain. It isn't any kind of object at all. Even if, however, to have a mind is just to have mental abilities, and certain neural processes occur whenever we exercise our mental abilities, the question remains how types of mental abilities are related to types of neural processes. Some dualists today eschew substance dualism, but nevertheless maintain a kind of property or attribute dualism. Substance dualists are also attribute dualists, but the claim is that one can be an attribute dualist without being a substance dualist. According to attribute dualists, mental attributes are distinct from physical attributes, and such attributes are linked only by fundamental, irreducible laws of nature. On this dualist view, psychophysical laws would thus be like the law of gravity in Newtonian mechanics, and like Schrödinger's equation in non-relativistic quantum mechanics. Physicists strive to find a group of fundamental laws that are so few in number that they can be written on a t-shirt. On the attribute or property dualist view, given that psychophysical laws are fundamental, if the fundamental laws of nature were written on a t-shirt, the print would have to be so small that you'd need to use an electron microscope to read them. But maybe that's just the way things are. Maybe the world isn't understandable just in terms of any small group of systematically well-integrated laws. No one ever promised things would be simple, or if they did, they shouldn't have. Even if to have a mind is just to have mental capacities and abilities, the question nevertheless remains what we ourselves are essentially. Personalities aren't individuals, but persons are. Although I have mental capacities and abilities, I'm not identical with those capacities and abilities. Indeed, it seems to be a category mistake to think that I'm identical to a cluster of abilities. I'm an individual. No individual is a capacity or ability. But what then am I? Am I an immaterial soul? If I'm not, then even if I have an immaterial, immortal soul, its continuation after my bodily death would not be my continuation, since I'm not it. If I am an immaterial soul, however, then how could I, as opposed to my body, be in space-time? And how could I make any causal difference in the natural world? Am I instead my body? Or am I my brain, or a part of my brain? My body and brain are complex physical systems. Our earlier question thus again rears its head. How could I, a thinking, feeling being, be a complex physical system, one understandable in wholly objective terms? I'm a person. But where do persons fit into the natural world as described by science? That question leads us to the mind-body problem. And subjectivity, the subjective life we are all acquainted with in our own case, and only our own case, can make the mind-body problem seem intractable. No one has fully adequate answers to these questions. Other creatures have minds, even if only little furry or feathery ones. I'll let that question just stand there. We, however, have self-conscious minds. We're capable of rational reflection. Tonight, we'll step back, draw a circle around these questions, rationally reflect on them, and thereby try to advance our understanding of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm Julien Musolino. I'm the second speaker. I'd love to stand here in front of you and give my presentation, but I'm going to step back in the middle of you. I'm the villain tonight. I'm going to play the role of the villain, and I'm going to try to convince you that we do not have immaterial soul. So give me a second to get set, and then we'll resume the conversation. All right, that's it. I'm in the middle of the crowd now. Can you all hear me well? Yes? Wonderful. So, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I really enjoy doing events like this one. I want to thank the people who organized the event. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, our dean, for putting this together. Thank you to the Honors College. Thank you, Brian, for your remarks. And thank you, Mark, for agreeing once again to debate this perennial question with me on the public stage. So, to set the stage for my presentation tonight, I thought that I would begin by showing you a very short video clip that beautifully and very dramatically captures the main idea that we're going to discuss tonight. So let's watch. So if anybody's driving back home tonight, make sure you buckle up. Heaven can indeed wait. This is the question of the soul, a question that has haunted our imagination since time immemorial. It raises a number of very, very interesting questions. Who believes in the soul today? What kind of soul do people believe in? Why do people believe that we have souls to the extent that they do? Does science have anything to say about whether we have souls or not? If so, if science has something to say, then what can we learn about the soul from science? What are the implications of these conclusions? And of course, why should anyone care? Why is this an important issue? Why should we talk about it? All these are questions that I address and discuss at length in my recent popular science book, The Soul Fallacy. So tonight, what I thought I would do is give you a very short sneak preview of some of the main ideas. So what I'm going to start doing is giving you the main claims that I make in the book, and then showing you the very small subset of claims that I'm going to address tonight. The first claim is that the traditional soul, that I will define very precisely in just a few moments, is not just a theological or a metaphysical claim. It's above all a scientific claim. Consequently, the existence of the soul is something that can be determined objectively. Moreover, science, modern science, gives us every reason to believe that human beings do not have immaterial souls. This conclusion, it turns out, has important implications for a range of issues that extend far beyond the realm of science, and sadly that I won't have time to talk about in my presentation, but I hope we'll be able to discuss them during the panel discussion. And that's the optimistic, the hopeful part at the end. I think that, and I argue in the book, that we have nothing to lose by letting go of our soul beliefs. In fact, I think that we even have something important to gain. So tonight I'm going to focus on these claims. What the soul is, according to most people, why it's a scientific question, and why science tells us powerfully that we do not have such a thing. Usually when I give a lot of public lectures to groups of people of different backgrounds, and very often when I suggest that we don't have a soul, that's the kind of reaction that I get. People really freak out. Well, how is it possible? There's really nothing to worry about. I think the attitude should be to relax. And I'll try to convince you of this during the Q&A session. It doesn't really change anything. If anything, it changed things for the better. However hard it is to believe without me having talked about the issues at length. So tonight I'm really going to talk about the tip of the iceberg. I want to make this clear. There's so many things I wish I could tell you, but I'm not going to have time to tell you. In fact, I'm going to talk about the tip of the iceberg, that part right there that you see, by necessity. So if we look at our culture, our society, let's say the United States, you may not know this, but we're a very religious country. We're unusually religious in the first world, given how rich we are. And public opinion has been polled systematically for decades. We know what people think. On the question of the afterlife and heaven and the soul, we've known for a long time that an overwhelming majority of the population in our country believes that we do have a soul and that it will live on after we die. 70, 80% of the population believes this narrative. These are all the polling agencies here that have conducted this research. We also live in a country where religion is marketed as aggressively as fast food and prescription drugs. This is an ad for what happens when you die. You're not going to be dead. You're going to meet with your creator. So something will go on to live. If you go to bookstores, you'll discover that there are tons of books written by all kinds of authors. New Age gurus, religious apologists, a handful of scientists who don't believe in the consensus, that tell you that there is proof of heaven, that there is life after death because there's evidence, 90 Minutes in Heaven. There are movies even that portray these ideas based on these books. A few years ago, I was very curious to see what happens with my own students who are taking courses in psychology, in philosophy, in neuroscience. What would they believe? So I devised a very simple questionnaire where I gave them a scale from 1 to 6. That psychologists love scales. So the question was simple: do you believe that you have a soul? First question. Provide your answer by picking a value on the scale below. 1 is definitely not, all the way to definitely yes, with values in the middle. And then I bombarded them with additional questions. I wanted to know more. For those who thought that they had a soul, and how would you define the concept of a soul? In other words, what is your soul? Please select all that apply. The first option is an immaterial entity separate from your body. Second option is a metaphor for the activity of your brain. In other words, your soul is purely physical. An outdated concept that is no longer relevant and plays no role in your functioning. And other. I've done this many times with many groups of students in the classroom, in the lab, and the results, surprisingly, at least to me at the beginning, always come out the same. So I'm going to show you results from a sample of close to 200 undergrads, people like most of you here who took my cognition class a few years ago. And I was just really amazed to discover that 80% of that sample picked a value between 4 and 6 on the question, do you believe that you have a soul? From probably yes to all the way to definitely yes, with 50% of that group saying, picking definitely yes as an answer. When they answered the second question, so how would you define the concept of the soul? The overwhelming majority told me that their soul is an immaterial entity that is separate from their body. What does your soul do? It doesn't just sit there and look pretty. Well, you can't see it, so it doesn't look pretty. But it gives you something of a psychological nature. These are percentages of answers that people selected. So 71% of the time students said that their souls give them a moral compass. It gives them consciousness. It gives them feelings, free will, their personality, their ability to make decisions. In other words, if you're teaching psychology, forget about it. People think it's the soul doing the decisions and the personality, not the brain. So my friends, my colleagues, you have some work to do there. So if we put all this together, specific studies on what people take the soul to be, combined with all the data that we have from national polls, combined with the result of other scientific studies, the picture that emerges is quite clear. Most people in the United States, and many more around the world, believe in a soul that has 3 key properties. The first is believed to be immaterial or non-physical. The second, it's believed to be what I call psychologically potent. In other words, it contributes to your psychological functioning. It gives you free will, a moral compass, your feelings, etc. And the third, of course, it's immortal. I didn't show you the results, but when I asked my students, is your soul immortal? The answer was overwhelmingly yes. It carries your consciousness into the afterlife, so you can recognize Uncle Fred in heaven. So that's what I call the traditional soul. It's empirically derived from what people believe. Is it the only way to define the soul? Of course not. But that's the soul that captures the imagination of most people in our country and around the world. That's why I'm focusing on this soul. And also it happens to be the soul, the kind of soul that lies at the heart of most religious doctrines. So that's why I think it's a really important notion to look at. It's very close to an idea that Brian mentioned that was made famous in the West, but certainly not invented by Descartes. Descartes did not invent dualism. Plato was a dualist, and even before Plato, if you go back to ancient Egypt, people were dualists. But nonetheless, this was made famous by Descartes in the 17th century, who talked about his physical substance, res extensa, the substance that's extended in space, and his mental substance, what he called res cogitans in Latin. Now that's what most people believe, outside of the ivory tower. If you step into the world in which I live, the world of science, the ivory tower, conclusions are very different. The overwhelming majority of scientists do not believe that we have such a soul. Here's Joshua Green, who's a young cognitive neuroscientist at Harvard, saying that most people are dualists, most non-scientists, that is. Intuitively, we think of ourselves not as physical devices, but as immaterial minds or souls housed in physical bodies. We scientists take the mind's physical basis for granted. Notice we scientists, not we philosophers. There's a difference there, which I hope we'll get to talk about later. Among the general public, it's a touchy subject. Indeed it is. Very sensitive because it has a lot to do with religion too. And you know that religion is a hot button issue. We have data on what scientists believe. We know. So this is a study that was published in Nature in 1998, which looked at whether elite scientists, members of the National Academy, believe in God or believe in the soul narrative and human immortality. This is 1914 right here. These are data from 1914, the beginning of the 20th century. Only a third of elite scientists back 100 years ago already believed in the soul narrative. Now watch what happens as the 20th century unfolds. This is 1933, and this is 1998. Less than 8% believe in human immortality. In other words, there's a consensus in the sciences which is away from human immortality, away from the soul. So here are the two views that we are asked to consider. On the one hand, we have dualism on the left, this notion that we're part body, part soul, the kind of soul that we just talked about, that most people believe in. On the other hand, we have a version of materialism, the idea that we're physical through and through. Of course, we're not like the Terminator. Okay, we don't have a metallic endoskeleton and we were not programmed to kill Sarah Connor. But the Terminator who can talk and reason and seems to be conscious, courtesy of its creator. If there is something it is like to be a Terminator. If you watch the movie, you see the world in red. You have parameters floating in front of your field of vision. In spite of all the things that the machine can do, being conscious, talking, planning, reasoning, we know it's a machine. There's no vapor or soul to it. That's the view that most scientists espouse today. We are physical through and through. We're biological versions of the Terminator. Now, interestingly, when I asked the students in my surveys whether they believe that the question of whether people have a soul is a question that can be answered objectively, at least in principle, and thus one that can be answered using scientific means, the overwhelming majority of soul believers at least said no. That's very interesting. Psychologists study those effects. It's called the scientific impotence excuse. If science threatens to disconfirm your beliefs, one approach is to say, well, it's not a scientific question, you see, so science can't touch it. But of course it is a scientific question. And it's not hard to see. And it comes from two properties of the claim that people make when they tell you they believe in the soul. The first has to do with detachability and autonomy of function. The claim, again, is, if I stand here, by the way, am I getting in the way of anybody or not? No? Okay. The claim is that your consciousness can continue to function separately from your body. This makes very clear predictions. If you have Uncle Fred's ashes in an urn, you're pretty confident that the body doesn't function anymore. Suppose now it were possible to talk to dead Uncle Fred. Then we'd have very good evidence, indeed, that it's possible for consciousness and the mind to function without the body. Sadly or happily, we don't have such evidence, but we could. It's very easy to design a controlled experiment that would show that if it were possible, one could talk to the dead. It's been tried for centuries. There's even a prize if you want to try. If you want to win $1 million, try this, do it carefully, and James Randi, the amazing Randi, has $1 million to offer you if you can show this happening under controlled experimental conditions. That's not the only way you could find out that consciousness can operate outside the confines of the body. People report having near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences, and they claim when they're in such states that their soul has temporarily detached from their body, and it can float around and see and hear everything. Well, some scientists have said, great, this makes a very clear, testable prediction. Let's put laptops on top of cabinets and closets, display specific information, and see, upon regaining consciousness, if people can recall accurately what they saw. Now, suppose they could. Suppose that from the vantage point of the body lying on the bed, there's no way you could see with your actual physical eyes, plus you're unconscious, what's displayed on the computer. But suppose nonetheless that upon regaining consciousness, the person faithfully, pun intended, I guess, recites the numbers or the sequences that he or she saw. Suppose you could replicate this in one lab, another lab, in one country, another country. Then you'd have very good evidence that indeed the mind and consciousness can operate without the body. But there is no such evidence, and it's been tried. So it is a scientific claim. The second reason it's a scientific claim is because of what I call causal interaction with ordinary matter. You've heard Brian talk about this. What killed the Cartesian doctrine in the 17th century, and if you read people in the 18th century, most of them, the doctrine was dead basically, is the so-called interaction problem. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia pointed this out to Descartes in a letter in 1643, and he's never been able to solve the problem. And developments in physics made the problem even worse later. But the idea, again, is that if your soul is psychologically potent, as people believe, then whatever that immaterial substance is has to be able to causally interact with the particles in your brain to make you feel a certain way, do a certain things. So when you say this, you are making a claim about physics, and physics is science. And so the whole thing is a scientific claim that you're making. People can stand up and say until they're blue in the face it's only a religious claim, but given the nature of the claim, it isn't. It is a scientific claim. And I'm not the first one to notice. If you read Bertrand Russell's classic essay on science and religion back in 1935, already he said, yeah, that he had a section on the soul and said it's purely, it is a scientific claim, and he said, I'm quoting now, that there could be evidence that would convince reasonable men. If you read religious apologists who tell you things like there's evidence for the soul, they even say themselves that there's scientific evidence for the soul, thereby acknowledging that the claim is scientific. Mark, in his book, The Soul Hypothesis, wrote, Mark or your co-author, that there's nothing, I'm quoting now, inherently anti-scientific about the soul hypothesis. Just a matter of finding out whether science will turn out to show that's true or false. So now we have two clear hypotheses. The first is our dualistic hypothesis, that human beings are composed of a physical body and an immaterial, psychologically potent and immortal soul, the soul that we defined earlier. Again, I defined the soul this way because that's the soul that most people believe in. So that's the one that's important to look at. Body and soul are distinct entities on this hypothesis, and the soul can continue to exist and function independently from the body after we die. That's the dualistic hypothesis. By contrast, the materialistic hypothesis is that the mind, the domain of the modern soul, we'll talk about the evolution of the soul, hopefully, during the Q&A session. It wasn't always about the mind. There were all kinds of souls in the past. The soul has shrunk as scientific understanding has progressed. The reason Descartes invoked his soul is that because he saw limits to his mechanical philosophy. The mechanical philosophy of the early scientific revolution could not, according to Descartes' thinking, account for mental phenomena, so he invoked a second substance. Scientists do that. There's a wonderful piece called The Perimeter of Ignorance that I encourage you all to read by the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, who shows that it's precisely when scientists stop understanding things that they invoke supernatural ideas. But so the mind then, the domain of the modern soul, cannot function separately from the body for the simple reason that our mental experiences are caused by physical activity now in our brains. Do we know how? No. But that doesn't matter. We have really good reasons to think that it does cause those experiences. So what we call the mind then, in modern cognitive science, is nothing but a description of the functioning of the brain at a certain level of abstraction. Body and mind are therefore two sides of the same coin. If I had more time, I would give you an analogy, but I don't, so I'll give it to you maybe a bit later. Now, notice that these two hypotheses can't both be true. They're mutually exclusive. Either we have a soul or we don't. Either dualism is true, substance dualism is true, or this version of materialism is true. They can't both be true. So how do we decide which one is true? Well, we know how to decide on scientific hypotheses. We've known for several hundred years. We decide in exactly the same way, in principle, that we decide whether the earth is flat or round. We look at the evidence. We ask the world to tell us what it is like. by doing experiments, by reasoning, by doing what scientists do. And when we do, we find that there is convergence, massive convergence of evidence supporting the materialistic hypothesis. That's what philosophers of science call consilience of evidence. And we find that all the evidence points away from the soul. So what I'm going to do now is, it's like kind of playing chess very fast. I'm going to play a blitz game, but I'll slow it down later and we'll discuss the specifics. But if we look at the soul, we find first that the soul has shrunk historically as scientific understanding has progressed. So when you think about the soul, think about a placeholder for human ignorance. We used to postulate souls in the past because we had no scientific understanding of biological and psychological phenomena. As those understandings progressed, souls started to melt like snow in the sun. There's one thing we still don't fully understand today, which is how the brain gives rise to consciousness. That's where the soul is. There's no formalism that describes the operation of the soul. When Isaac Newton proposed his law of gravitation, he was deeply puzzled by it. There's a famous quote by him saying that the conclusion is absurd. He refused to believe it because it violated common sense. But he had equations. He had formalism, and those equations allowed him to make very careful predictions. There is no such thing when it comes to the soul. Nobody's ever made a clear prediction about how people are going to behave or what they're going to say or do based on a set of soul equations. There's no objective empirical evidence supporting the soul, but there could be. We could be talking to the dead right now, or we could be seeing people with out-of-body experiences reciting what they see on laptops, but there isn't such evidence. Souls fly in the face of what we know about modern science. Souls are contradicted flatly by biology, evolutionary biology, and most importantly by modern physics. There's no explanatory gain that comes from postulating the existence of the soul. We all want to know how consciousness works. We don't know. Now try this as a thought experiment. Say to yourself, the soul does it. Now ask yourself, do you understand this any better? The answer is no. So there's no explanatory gain that comes from postulating the soul. And finally, there's overwhelming evidence that supports the materialistic alternative. Evidence you can all learn about if you take classes in neuroscience and psychology and linguistics even. So the soul has exactly the set of properties that it should have if it didn't exist. And that's why most working scientists have abandoned it. Now I want to end by showing you a couple of quotes from Sean Carroll is a well-known theoretical physicist who wrote, so you can take a look at this and read it. It's online, it's in Scientific American. It's called Physics and the Immortality of the Soul. And he's got a wonderful book called The Big Picture. So after looking at the question, that's what Sean Carroll concludes. So again, remember, we're trying to decide whether dualism or materialism is true. He says, the choice you're faced with becomes clear. Either overthrow everything we think we've learned about modern physics. I mean, let this resonate in your minds. Forget about your cell phones, forget about your computers. Overthrow everything we've learned about modern physics. Or distrust the stew of religious accounts, unreliable testimony, wishful thinking that makes people believe in the possibility of life after death. It's not a difficult decision as scientific theory choice goes. He then concludes by saying that I often hear people say, well, we don't really know what it's like to be dead, so how can you say anything about this? Well, here's the answer. There's no reason to be agnostic about ideas that are dramatically incompatible with everything we know about modern science. We've never dropped a man on the surface of the sun, but we have a pretty good idea of what would happen if we did, based on everything we know about modern physics and modern science and the composition of human bodies and the kind of heat that you have on the sun. So there's no reason to be agnostic on the question of the soul. Okay, I can see the looks on many of your faces, so I want to end with something positive. It's music, it's fun, but there's something interesting about. So let's play this and then I'll just make one last remark.
All right, this is an oldie, but well, It's an oldie where I come from.
This is, of course, Back to the Future. I'm sure you've all seen it.
Listen to some blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Way down in Louisiana, down in New Orleans, way back up in the woods along the evergreens, there stood a log cabin made of earth and wood. Where lived a country boy named Johnny Good. Never ever learned to read or write so well. He could play a guitar just like he's ringing a bell. Go, 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 Johnny, go, 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 Johnny, go, 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 Johnny, go, go. Where's your little bit? Let's go, go. Johnny be good. Go, Johnny, go, go. Go, Johnny, go, go, go. Go, Johnny, go, go. Go, Johnny, go, go, go. Johnny be good.
Guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
So that's what I would say to many of you. You may not be ready for this yet, but your kids are going to love it. The conclusions I drew, of course. Thank you. You want the clicker?
Yes.
Yeah. Here. So good. Sorry. Hold on. So right forward, back, left is back.
All right, well, Julien cast himself as the villain, so I guess that puts me in the role of the hero. I'm not sure that I can bear that responsibility, and you'll see my slides have black backgrounds and no fun video clips. So maybe I need to be the villain to the villain, or whatever. And I'll try to be, we're running a little late, but I'll try to wrap it up so that we have time for some discussion and so on too. I'll try to make a relatively small focused argument and then show some ways of generalizing on that too. I'm calling what I'm saying the limits of computational theory of mind. You all start falling asleep, so I throw in quickly a subtitle, maybe we have souls after all, to try to perk you up. I've picked as a motto for my talk, taking seriously the fact that we're sponsored by the Cognitive Science Center. I'll talk a little bit about cognitive science and what we know from that. And in particular, I'm going to take my motto from a 2000 book by Jerry Fodor, who happens to be the founder of our Cognitive Science Center here at Rutgers, and a very famous first-generation cognitive science. And as he meditates on these things, he says, what our cognitive science has done so far is mostly throw some light on how much dark there is. Show limits to what we did. This was his book was a response to Steven Pinker's book, How the Mind Works, which presents many of the same kinds of arguments that Julien does. Pinker was one of the ones who endorsed Julien's book. Jerry's the crank who says, no, I'm not convinced. I'll try to show you why he wasn't convinced, why I'm not convinced, why you don't have to be convinced necessarily, even though I admit Julien had very nice slides. There's lots of scientific disciplines that might be relevant to this topic. First and foremost is cognitive science. Also relevant is neuroscience. And as Julien mentioned, more remotely, biology becomes relevant, chemistry, physics. I thought in his book, Julien talked mostly about neuroscience. I think in his talk, he talked mostly about physics. I'll talk mostly about cognitive science. Why? Because I think it functions at the right level of discussion. It's really about the mind. This event is officially sponsored by the Rutgers Cognitive Science Center, right? And well, that's happened to be what I know the most about. So that doesn't mean I won't talk a little later about things I know less about, but it makes sense to start with what you know the most about, maybe. So what is cognitive science? There are different ways of describing it, and I don't mean it should have a tidy discussion, but here are some ways of talking about it. I think one way of looking at cognitive science is it's built around one big unifying theoretical idea, which is the computational theory of mind. And if cognitive science has got its finger on something that's worth stating next to Newton's theory of gravitation and Darwin's theory of evolution and so on, that's the big idea in it. There are other things it could be too, a miscellaneous grab bag of interesting results and methods. I don't denigrate that at all. Lots of cool results that we can talk about or so on. Or it can be bullshit, frankly. It can be a fancy word for intimidating people into believing what you say. Of those different means, I think this is the one that's most worth talking about in this. So it's this one particular science, namely cognitive science, built around this theoretical idea. What does that have to do with this question about souls that we're talking about today? What's the computational theory of mind then? Well, it's simply the theory that the mind performs computations. The bold version is that that's all that the mind does. The more modest version is that that's an important part of what the mind does. And what are computations? Well, those are things that were defined for us by Alan Turing. And I'm going to emphasize defined because I'm a former math major, partly, but also definitions don't kind of go away. That's there. So computations were defined by Turing, and that's how we know how to implement intelligence in a purely physical system. Julien talks about this more in his book than he did today, but one of the things he says is, look, we can build intelligent machines. We can build the Terminator. And the Terminator is pretty impressive in what it can do. We know there isn't a soul there because we didn't put a soul in there when we built it. And I suppose he has in mind real conditions, real machines, not just science fiction ones. Well, what are computations? As I say, defined by Turing in a mathematical system. Well, roughly this, I'm not going to be totally detailed, but a Turing machine is something that can read a symbol on a tape. It can advance the tape. It can write a symbol down on the tape. What it does at each point is a function of the current symbol and the internal state of the machine. Sounds a little simple and quaint. Turing is the one who invented the computer. We know computers are fancier electronic than that. But the point of the mathematical definition is anything that you can compute with that simple system. So that's powerful enough to do anything that a computer can do. And I see my colleague Bruce Tesser is here, who's actually a computer scientist, so he probably can correct me later. That's what I hate about science. And math, which has its definitions. So where are we? Okay, so that's what computation is. And it's a powerful idea, simple machine that can compute anything that's computable, basically. But it has certain intrinsic limits built into it by definition. But not going to go away. One is that it's intrinsically local. So the only information that the computer can take into account is the symbol that's right in front of it now. And there's ways to make it look at a couple of other symbols too by advancing its tape or whatever, but it can only look at what's in front of it now. The other thing, maybe even more important, is that it's intrinsically syntactic. What that means is that its actions are determined by the symbol in front of it without knowing what that symbol means. So think about modern computers. They look at strings of ones and zeros and they make them into new strings of ones and zeros. They don't have a clue what I, the programmer, meant by the ones and zeros. That doesn't come into it. They're just working on the order of the ones and zeros. I might have meant it as my bank account, but it doesn't know that. It doesn't care whether it means my bank account or a picture of my daughter or whatever, ones and zeros. And it's exactly these properties, the locality and the syntactic part of it, that makes it possible to realize it in a physical system. Those are the things that make it able to do that physically. Therefore, the result of that is that computation is a great account of certain kinds of reasoning. Certain kinds. In particular, deductive reasoning. Why deductive reasoning? Because deductive reasoning follows from a well-defined set of premises. It's local. You've listed exactly what your assumptions are. And it draws the conclusions that follow because of the form of those premises, syntactic. Here's an example. Here's what computers can do. You feed it A and B, and it can give you B by conjunction reduction. You feed it if A, then B, and also A, then it can give you B by if-then statements. Notice that this computer can do this because it doesn't matter what A and B mean. Maybe A means we have immortal souls, and B means we can talk to the dead. Then we can conclude that we can talk to the dead. Doesn't matter what you plug into those things. Those are valid conclusions regardless of what A and B might actually mean. So therefore, computation is a great account of deductive reasoning, and we can have intelligent machines, things that we know don't have souls, that can be great at playing chess, proving theorems, doing numerical calculations, recognizing patterns, things like that. And notice that these are exactly the things that we usually think of as signs of intelligence, right? A sign of intelligence is playing good chess and proving mathematical theorems. It isn't talking to your friend or walking across the room or things like that. But these are also deductive. Why? Because you can give a finite set of axioms to the chess. And it doesn't matter what pawn to queen 4 means. You can just manipulate that. There's no reference to the real world outside of the game. So the computers are good at that. Computation also gives us a great account of what we call information processing. This is a little plug for cognitive science here. They're great at transferring information from one format into another, which is something we know the brain does a lot beneath the level of consciousness. This is one of the big discoveries of modern cognitive science, is how much information processing you are doing unconsciously all the time. It's an enormous amount of complicated stuff. Modern theories of vision, language, and so on depend on this, and those are wonderful things. I've spent my life doing that, sort of. And you could too. At least you could major in it as an undergraduate, and Sarah will sign you up. I'm not dissing cognitive science at all, even though my motto is one of the great things about it is it sheds light on how much darkness there is. Here then comes to my point, though, where I make a little room for the soul. Computation gives no account of other kinds of reasoning by definition. The idea that gives it power in this one domain makes it incapable of doing things in other domains. In particular, it gives no account of what philosophers sometimes call abductive reasoning, inference to the best overall explanation. I'll give you some simplistic examples in a moment. But this is reasoning that's not local, in that it doesn't depend ahead of time on what information might be relevant. And reasoning that's not syntactic, it's reasoning that draws conclusions based on the meaning of the premises rather than on their form. Computational theory of mind gives you no leverage on that kind of reasoning. This is Fodor's point. It's possible that that kind of reading is an illusion, that it doesn't really happen. We don't really do abductive reasoning. I'll come back to that. Here's a little example to give you a hint of the difference between deduction versus abduction. So suppose you have the premise, Mary is late and John is hungry. What can we conclude? Deductive conclusion, John is hungry. There you go. Another deductive conclusion, Mary is late. That's about all you can do with deductive reasoning from that simple premise. What can you do with abductive reasoning? Well, interesting things like John will get dinner started. Or maybe John will go out to McDonald's. Or maybe John will criticize Mary when she gets home, and Mary will say, I'm going to throw the bum out, and they'll be divorced, and their relationship will be over. But here what we're doing is we're reasoning based on the meaning of these statements, not just their syntactic form. And we're using background information, in fact, all kinds of background information, not specify what kind of background information might be relevant. That's the inductive form of reasoning as opposed to the deductive form. And now I ask, well, which of these is more interesting? More importantly, which of these is more characteristic of human reasoning? And I submit to you abduction. Deductive reasoning is great. And computers can do a lot more than that. You can chain long chains of deductive reasoning to get more impressive results than what I gave you. But they're not abduction. I was a nerdy kid, believe it or not, grow up on Sherlock Holmes stories and Mr. Spock from Star Trek, who are logical. But actually, they're not using deductive logic for whatever they say. They're using abductive reasoning. I took elementary logic as an undergraduate at MIT, and it's just proving math theorems. It doesn't tell you the secret of life or what truth sort of things are. Now here we have to talk a little bit about why do I think that that people really do abductive reasoning, because that's going to come out to be a magical power. That's the point. That's where the miracle comes. Do people really have the capacity to do abductive reasoning? Well, sometimes one can get the illusion of a semantic inference if a clever programmer makes a syntax that tracks the semantics somehow. So you take what's meaning and you make it into form, and then the computer can operate over the form. So if you can turn meaning into form, then you can get the illusion of abductive reasoning by reasoning. And that's a possibility. So for example, we say John killed the fly, and we conclude the fly died. That was based on the meaning of killing, not on the shape of the sentence. You had to know what the word killed mean to make that conclusion. So that's a semantic conclusion. That's more like abduction than like deduction. But you can say, wait a minute, kill means cause to die. So I can make my computer say, anytime it sees kill, it just replaces it with those symbols, cause to die. That would be syntactic. And now I have John killed the fly becomes John caused the fly to die, and then I can just top out that part and get the fly died. Then I transformed what was looked like it was an inference based on meaning to what's an inference based on form of the syntactic structure. And you can do that in some cases. You can change bachelor into unmarried male and so on. So it's possible, maybe Julien will say this, I don't know, but it's possible that abductive reasoning is an illusion. We don't really do it, we just look like we're doing it because of these kind of computer engineering sort of things that are in our minds somehow. But we know from lots of linguistic work that in fact this kind of replacement works only in a few special cases. Most words don't have those tidy definitions. Maybe even these words don't, but I won't parade that. So do people really have the capacity to do abductive reasoning? Channeling my inner Fodor, he says yes. It's seen most clearly in our ability to do science itself. It's based on understanding, not on deductive inference. And anything in principle can be relevant to anything. There's no way to build that into a machine that we can do that along any lines that we know of at this point. And I think that you see the same thing in a more everyday sense, just in the way we understand language. Natural language, in fact, involves some abductive reasoning, I would claim. In particular, I'm showing the interesting thing in English about how you assign antecedents to pronouns, how you know what the pronouns mean. So I start with, John wasn't feeling well, so he went to his doctor yesterday. In that sample sentence, we've got John and his doctor, and then we have subsequent pronouns, and we can figure out how those pronouns work. What do those pronouns mean? Well, here's two continuations. He examined him for an hour, but could find nothing seriously wrong. What does that mean? Well, probably you said, that he is the doctor doing the examining, and that him is John, the one being examined. But I could also continue this way. He questioned him for an hour about what his symptoms could mean, but wasn't satisfied by the answers. Now that he is probably John, and that him is probably the doctor. Why? Well, because we understand how going to the doctor works, and examining, and questioning, and so on. So we know how these people probably played those roles. We understand the situation, basically. We did not do it syntactically. Why? Well, that's the subject of the sentence, and it's referring to the direct object. That's the subject of the sentence, and it's referring to the subject of the sentence. The regularities here aren't syntactic based on the form of the sentences, the shape of the sentences. It's based on grasping the meaning. And in fact, I won't give you all of these other examples, but you can tell interesting stories here where what goes into deciding what the pronouns refer to is all kinds of stuff. All kinds of stuff. Not the syntactic structure of the sentence, but our grasp of what's probably going on there. No one in linguistics, anyway, thinks that assigning antecedents to pronouns can be done syntactically by the shapes of the sentences or so on, as opposed to grasping the meaning. And in fact, we go back to, remember, computers can play chess and prove mathematical theorems, but they can't talk to you. I know Google wants to sell you something that can tell you the score of the Yankees game, but it won't be able to carry out a conversation and assign antecedents to your pronouns and so on. And here we can compare the famous Turing test with what Descartes said all of those years ago. The Turing test was when Turing says that you could put a question and answer game and have somebody carry out a conversation, and they can guess whether they're conversing with a person or a computer. Can the computer trick the person into thinking that they're talking to a person, not a computer? Then we would say that computers are intelligent, and then we would, Turing thought that we'd be able to do that by now. We'd be able to do that within 50 years. In contrast, Descartes, 300 years earlier, thinks that we wouldn't be able to do that. They, machines, could never use words or other signs arranged in a manner as competent for us to declare our thoughts to others. Machines, you can make them set fixed expressions and so on, but they could never carry out a conversation, basically. So Descartes' test for souls is the same as Turing's test for intelligent machines. And Descartes was right that machines can't do that, and Turing was wrong that machines would be able to do that, and it crucially hinges on this idea of abduction, I think. Ability to draw conclusions based on meaning rather than on syntactic form. So here's the argument that I've been developing, and I'm not going much shorter than my colleagues. I guess we're all long-winded here. Humans can reason abductively as well as deductively. Abductive reasoning is not computational by definition. Computation is the only sort of reasoning that we know how to implement physically. It's what computers can do. Therefore, human beings display a sort of reason that we don't know how to implement physically. Therefore, there might be an aspect of human reason that can't be understood as primarily a purely physical process. There might be something else in there. And this is exactly in the area traditionally assigned to the soul, all the way back to Plato, as we've heard. Human reason is one of the things which you're supposed to need a little dose of magic for. And maybe we still do. There's no evidence in cognitive science that we don't. A couple of reflections on it before I yield the floor and actually listen to what you might all have to say. Julien in his book talks about what we new dualists are about, and he talks about our various bad arguments. This is exactly what Julien would call a soul of the gaps argument, parallel to notorious God of the gaps arguments. He says that they're fallacious and terrible arguments. The whole fallacy comes from that. I beg to disagree. I agree that this kind of argument is comparatively weak in the sense that as we learn new things, it might get overturned. Maybe somebody has a new idea about what mechanical intelligence can do. Maybe somebody has a new idea into how abductive reasoning really works. Then quit. But I'm fine with giving a weak argument that will be overturned by progress on things. But that's not the same thing as a flawed argument or an invalid argument. In fact, if this argument has been valid for 3,000 years and nobody's solved this particular nut, that's not a bad argument, right? Even if you're weak, you're strong if everybody else is weaker. Something like that. And here I think it's important to put into context, too, what kind of a gap do we have here? I'll be interested. Julien and I have talked before, but we've never talked about this directly. But, so the problem of abductive reasoning, according to Fodor, is a mystery, not a problem or a puzzle. This is slightly cooler terminology for what Brian was talking about when he talked about cognitive closure, basically. So a problem is something that we know how to approach. We're making progress. We just need a little more time to work it out. Sure, you're doing great on your problem set, but you need an extension of 24 hours so you can finish it. That would be one thing. Whereas a mystery is something we have no idea how to get started on. Maybe somebody will figure it out, but it's going to need a new idea that nobody's ever had before in the history of the world. We just don't know how to get started. Well, this abduction, problems, we shouldn't worry too much about those. But mysteries, we can take a little more seriously. In general, I think there's never a formula for what you do with a gap. And we're in a situation of extrapolation, not interpolation. And how you go about that depends on what background assumptions you have. Here's a little picture. Not as cool as Julien's, I admit, but I was trying with graphics. So, soul of the gaps argument. Well, I think it might depend on how strong is that. I think it might depend on the kind of gap you have. What's the lay of the land look like? So when Julien and other scientists talk, they think, okay, we've practically finished everything. The soul is retreating before more and more knowledge and so on. Well, they're painting a picture like this. This is scientific knowledge. That's scientific knowledge. We almost have a continuous line from here to here. There's a couple of little gaps along the line. Well, then, yes, I agree. It's a little weaselly to get too upset about those. But I'm not sure that's the lay of the land. Here's another comparison. Maybe we have our lines of scientific understanding with little gaps in them, but the gap we're interested in is this one. What's the two things about it? Two things. It's not a small gap, it's a big gap. And the other thing is it isn't along the line of scientific progress, but it's another dimension entirely. That, I think, we could think about differently as a gap. And it's worth talking out here that abduction, which I've been talking about because it goes to the heart of the definition of cognitive science and so on, isn't the only mystery in the vicinity of the mind here either. Brian talked about others, and Julien said, there's the issue of free will. There's the issue in intentionality, how our thoughts can have the property of being true and false. I have true beliefs or false beliefs, but physical systems don't have that property. And the issue of conscious experience, which Julien mentioned himself, was a mystery. So we don't have just one mystery here, we've got others. I purposely talked about one of the less familiar ones, this and this being way more familiar. But notice that these are all arguably interrelated, intrinsic to our notion of being a human. They cohere arguably with the soul as the seat of reason, meaning, will, and experience, which is what it's always been. There are still mysterious things about that. Why not? Maybe this would point to a new way of understanding. I would also say that not all understanding is scientific understanding. Julien would agree with that. But science is a way of studying certain kinds of things. Small, simple, physical things. And then you can add it up in various ways. It's not necessarily the way of like understanding your roommate, for example. I do not recommend using the scientific method on your roommate. There are Big Bang Theory episodes about this or so on. They don't usually go so well. Now, as I close, I've mostly talked about cognitive science because I know something about that. Would it be different if we talked about neuroscience? I say probably no. First of all, we know practically nothing about how abstract knowledge is represented in the brain anyway. And the obvious data, I mean, I know that brain damage does mess up your life. My mother has brain damage and it has messed up her life, and I worry about it happening to me too. But that kind of data shows that a functioning brain is necessary for minds as we know them. Not necessarily that it's sufficient for minds that we know. And I point out here that not all dualism has to be strict Cartesian dualism in the way that we talked about here. My colleague Dean Zimmerman isn't here, but his bit would have gone there. But we've gone over time, so therefore it's just as well he isn't here, right? For example, for the reasons that Julien and Brian both talked about, I think we'd have to say that a person's soul does have a physical location, near or at the body. Okay, so Descartes took a radical kind of view of that, and that was interesting, drove the discussion forward. But we might have to back down on that part and say, yeah, souls, and the common notion of souls. Julien didn't ask that in his question. People think, where is the soul? They probably do think it's, right around here, somewhere. That's just a final summary. Our cognitive science has done so far has thrown some light on how much darkness there is, and here are the steps in the argument that was at the core of my talk. Thank you.
They'll now sit up here and you guys can ask questions. I guess so what do you guys think? Do you have questions for our speakers? Is there?
Sorry.
Yes, we have a question.
This is a question for Professor Baker.
Yes.
Given the possibility of this huge gap that you illustrated, why, in your opinion, are the 76%?
Start over again.
Yeah, given the possibility of this huge gap.
Yeah.
Can you all hear the question, by the way? People in the back too? Yeah? Okay.
Why is it that in your opinion, that 76% of scientists nowadays reject the possibility of a non-material substance?
A couple of thoughts. First of all, let's turn around the 76% for just a minute. That's 24% that are on the other side. That's not nothing. Basically, most of them are being asked about things that aren't in their expertise, right? Feynman or whoever we want to bring out is a theoretical physicist and brilliant man and so on. But this isn't primarily, physics has a contribution to play in this, but he wouldn't probably never tried to understand Jerry Fodor's argument about abduction. It's not in his expertise. If you're a great scientist, then you're invited sometimes to talk about all kinds of things, and they take advantage of that platform, and rightly so. But we should remember what's in their expertise and what's not in their expertise.
You have a question back here?
No. Don't respond.
I wanted to ask if people who believe in a soul, I guess dualists, have a particular leaning towards any particular belief in non-human animal cognition or non-human animal, animals having a soul, and what is science? What can science tell us currently about non-human animal cognition?
Is that for Mark?
Who's that for?
I guess whoever.
Well, yeah, you asked about dualists. It's I think that dualists. There are many different kinds of dualists. Descartes famously said animals don't have souls, and facilitated brutality to animals. A lot of current dualists that I know believe that animals do have souls. I personally would be agnostic about that. I don't have any evidence that my mother's beloved dog can reason abductively. Most of those things that I showed you have to do with human reason, human language capacities. My dog doesn't have those, so that argument doesn't apply. I would be agnostic about that.
So we absolutely know that dogs, for example, do not have effective reasoning capacity.
I would say we don't have a lot of evidence for that. Mostly we need to look at the very fine-grained stuff we have in language. Chimpanzees are a better case. And basically what you do with chimpanzees is you look at what they do to try to trick the experimenter into giving them the bananas. And they can be pretty clever about that. And then you ask, okay, does that give you evidence about abductive reasoning? But I think that there's a lot of interpretation that goes into that. Being conservative, I would be agnostic about that. I would say that human beings animals show nothing like our language behavior. So the issues of intentionality and abductive reasoning and free will as it's expressed in our language, we don't have any evidence of that in animals. Are animals conscious? Probably yes, to some degree. There you go.
I have a lot of questions, so I'm trying to narrow down. But so going off the animal thing, which is not what I was going to initially ask at all. So it seems like, I forget your name in the middle, I'm sorry.
Julien.
Julien. It seems like, so you gave immaterial, immortal, and psychologically potent as what people consider to be the soul.
That's right.
But then if we're talking about just objective reasoning, that seems only like psychologically potent to me. So it seems like that animals not having objective reasoning, unless you need all three of those things to have a soul. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like animals could still have a soul under this conception of a soul. Do you have to fulfill all three requirements to be a soul? Is it a different kind of soul? It seems, and also to me, if, say, chimpanzees do have objective reasoning, then it's like, do we just keep going down the line, and as soon as some animal doesn't have objective reasoning, then they don't have a soul? That seems sort of absurd to me, and like a problem of vagueness. I don't know, that was a lot of things in one thing, so maybe you could comment on that.
Who are you asking?
Both of you guys, I guess.
Well, from my perspective and the perspective of, it's not, by the way, it's not 70, it's higher than this, but that's a separate issue. But to answer this question, and then get back to yours really quickly, I think the reason why 90-something% of modern scientists don't believe in the soul is simply because, as I said, there's no evidence and flies in the face of everything we know about modern science. Now, notice that what you heard from Mark, it's very nice, very clever, but it didn't touch anything that I said. All it said is, look, there's stuff we don't understand, and therefore maybe we have a soul. But
Right, but I think I'm wondering, I know that you don't
But back to your question, so the answer is, from the modern perspective, human beings don't have souls and neither do animals. That settles the question, if you think like a modern scientist, or like most modern scientists. Now, then you can ask questions like, are animals conscious? And then you can do science on this. So there's an aspect of consciousness that scientists discuss called access consciousness, which is different from what the philosophers talk about. And on that, there are objective markers of whether a creature has access consciousness and is likely to therefore be conscious. And on that score, it's very likely, after all, animals have nervous systems that are very similar to ours in many respects. So most scientists believe that animals are conscious. But the notion of the soul, the soul is simply irrelevant to working scientists. Nobody talks about it.
I think I meant based on the modern conception, though, which you said has those three characteristics.
Yes.
What if it has two of those characteristics? Then does it cease to be a soul?
Can I just interject something?
Sure.
Thomas Huxley, who I mentioned, the person who said how you get a consciousness out of irritating nervous tissue is as mysterious as how you get the genie out of rubbing a lamp. But he held the view that we're what he called conscious automata. What he thought we were is he thought we were machines, but that we were also conscious. But he dropped the potency condition. He said, but consciousness has no causal effects. It's what nowadays it's called epiphenomenal. It's just causally impotent. So there have been people historically who've dropped that condition.
But like the general consensus, I guess we don't know.
I don't know if there is a consensus. Probably the leading, the philosophers, the leading dualist these days, David Chalmers, and he is toyed with being an epiphenomenalist, saying, we have consciousness, it's not anything physical, but it has no causal influence. That's hard to believe, because, take the feeling of pain, which they count as a conscious state. If it has no causal influence, then not only why am I wincing, but what do I believe I'm in pain? The pain has feeling feeling pain has nothing to do with that, but that's a view they accept. You know. They just give up the cause. They handle the causal argument by saying it doesn't have any causal influence.
If you want to know what I thought, the way that you broke that down was very relevant to what I was trying to say in my talk, where I would have said the soul is immaterial and psychologically potent, but not intrinsically immortal. So I would keep the first two, but not necessarily the third. I think it was Brian mentioned, for Plato it was easy, or maybe for Descartes it was easy. If the soul has no parts, then it can't be destroyed. But I think the modern dualists that I know of wouldn't go that way, and that if we have immortality, it's because, say, God does something to preserve our soul, not that our soul is continues just by the nature of what it is.
Yeah, so even if most people associate all three ideas, you can drop some of them.
Right.
But then it goes to show that, the definition of the soul that I worked with is the one that most people believe in. But as I said, other people have different notions of the soul. So for each notion, you have to think about that notion in particular. What's the nature of the claim, right? So some people, for example, use the word soul metaphorically. They say things like, what my soul is the sum total of my personality and my experiences. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not making any grandiose metaphysical claim. It's not talking about immortality. It's not even a scientific question. So the answer is, it really depends on what people mean. We can pick any definition of the soul that we want, and then we can ask, what's the claim that's being made, and think about it, right? And that's often done. So not all definitions of the soul that you can come up with would have the same implications, and et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. If we could depart from the soul status of animals for a second. This is a question for Mark. I understand that we have limited time with these presentations, but I was just curious how it just seems to me that the leap from computational and inductive reasoning to an idea of an immaterial soul that goes beyond space and time is a pretty big jump. I think you talked a lot about the idea of shedding light on the darkness, and as far as from an Occam's razor type standpoint, it seems more likely to connect that we might just haven't discovered how to introduce abductive reasoning into technology rather than the idea that it's because of the soul. So my question is just, can you help me fill in the gap between immaterial soul and abductive reasoning in humans?
No. Julien made the point, which I can see why he feels this way, that, I take my ignorance about conscious and then I say, the soul does that, and have I deepened your understanding? Julien says, no. I see his point. Of all of them, actually, I have a riff on intentionality, the problem of meaning. That's the one where I can fill in maybe most of where the soul does. And my collaborator, Dean Zimmerman, maybe has some more thoughts about that. But that does really need to be talked about for sure. But one of the things would be that, okay, we need something that's able to grasp meanings beyond just forms. Well, what kind of thing could do that? It would need to be something that had a different relationship to the world than just basing things on parts. So I can't, well, Julien said, there's no equation for the soul or so on. Well, there's no equation for your roommate either, right? It's that not everything is understood mechanistically with equations. It's wonderful when that can be done. But I think there are things here that call for a different kind of understanding.
I'd like to ask a question to Julien about how you relate to the question of the Occam's razor, right? Because suppose you're trying to explain to someone who posits a soul that you can experiment, right? You can empirically test it, right?
Test what?
That the existence or non-existence of the soul, right?
So on some definition of the soul, we have to be precise. It makes predictions, and then you can look to see if there's, that's right, absolutely, yes.
So going from there, what if they claim, a theist or something, for X, Y, Z reasons, God will obfuscate the thing, right?
Sure.
So what I'm saying is that then it will obfuscate the experiment. It implies the question of Occam's razor because they're putting, they're positing all sorts of things.
But
to get in the
so
way.
my answer to this is if we start playing those games, we should all go home and stop doing science, right? I mean, so I've heard arguments like, well, evolution is not really true because God was really planting fossils to confuse scientists. If we're willing to play those kinds of intellectual games, we should all go home. I mean, anything goes, sure. But if you want to be serious and try to understand stuff, then we play a different game. And we play a game called science where we play by certain rules. Of course, anybody can say anything. Right? But if you want to cure cancer, for example, it's not going to work to say, well, I'm not going to worry about curing cancer because God decided that's incurable, so let's just go home. So these games are fun to play, but they're completely useless practically. They don't yield any understanding, and I'm not very moved by them, frankly.
No, I agree with that point. I'm saying, in your opinion, where does the positing of additional causes kind of reach an end, or right? Where would you, for example, the thing about God planting the fossils? I would say that goes over my Occam's razor number, propositions I would accept. But how many propositions would you accept?
Well, the first thing you'd have to do is you'd have to convince scientists that there is a God. There's a burden of proof on that. So once you've convinced people of that, then you can ask whether this God does this or that. But you seem to presume that there is a God. Not at all a question that we could presume. Again, it depends on first you have to say what kind of God you believe in. If it's a theistic God, a God that intervenes in the universe, where you have manifestations of his interventions, like miracles and everything, that's a scientific claim, right? Because there are observable effects in the universe that God has. Anything observable and measurable, that's fair game for science. So if you're theist, then that's one thing. If you're a deist, for example, and claim that God is just the first cause, so he set up the universe and then it basically unfolded according to the laws of nature, you're making a different kind of claim. So it depends. But whether you're a theist or a deist, you first have to show us and convince us that there is such a thing. Most scientists do not think that there is a theistic God, because theistic gods are scientific propositions, and I think they've been ruled out. I know it sounds crazy to say to people in the general public, but they've been ruled out. Think about it this way. We used to think, if you go back in time, that anything was supernatural. We didn't understand anything before science, a long time ago. So human origins were magical. The result of war was magical. Women were witches, causing all kinds of calamities. Now, in any area where we've made any progress, the weather was magical, it was God's doing this and that. In any area where we've made any progress, we don't have those ideas anymore. In fact, I'd like for someone to find one case, just one case, where we now understand things and we said, aha, we were right all along, it was some God doing this. That never happens. The supernatural is just a placeholder for our ignorance. Once we start understanding things, we don't have a need for the supernatural, or God, or the soul anymore.
Sarah, you might have to.
Yeah.
You know what you could do? You could assign people numbers, have them remember their number, and they just pull the numbers out.
Very useful. But this is fun. That's great.
I think somebody here had their hand up front. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So basically, my questions, there were a lot of questions, and I'm combining them in, throughout the presentation, I kept on having different questions, and I'll combine them into one. So basically, talking to science not having evidence for soul right now, could it be that it's beyond science for now, so it's a matter of faith? And after science reaches a point that may not happen, which I think is completely understandable.
Yeah.
That it would be part of science, but that's not the case. So I was thinking, so what if the soul is physical,
okay,
but it's so small that it can't be seen?
Like an atom, for example,
Yeah,
something like that? We know they're there for all kinds of reasons, but okay.
And what if it's different from the mind and conscious, which the entire presentation was focused on it being related to the mind and related to consciousness. Like, what if it's totally separate from that and a physical thing? So the Cartesian well, it was problematized because there wasn't a physical thing. But what if it's physical? Two small seeds.
Well, then, if that's the case,
I'm sorry, can we repeat the question?
the question was, what if the soul is actually physical but very, very tiny, and we just simply haven't seen it yet? Then you'd have to talk to physicists about this, right? Because they're in the business of figuring out what's very tiny that you can't see, all kinds of particles, the Higgs boson. I would suggest you read the book by Sean Carroll, The Big Picture, in which he talks about all these questions. And so the point I was making is the following, right? On the definition of the soul that most people believe in, the reason scientists no longer believe in this is for the following reason. Suppose I were to claim to you that I have a friend who can run a marathon under 10 minutes, okay? And I say, look, he's not enhanced, he's a regular human being, he's just a very athletic guy, and he can run a marathon under 10 minutes. How plausible would this claim be? Extremely implausible, given what we know about human locomotion, given what we know about the length of marathons, so given what we know about how the world works. You could not possibly believe seriously that a real, unenhanced human being could run a marathon under 10 minutes. What scientists are saying is the same thing. Given what we know about modern science, this notion of the soul is as implausible as the claim that we can run a marathon under 10 minutes. It's even worse than this for the soul. If you read what people like Sean Carroll or Frank Wilczek, the Nobel Prize winner in physics in 2003, will tell you, this again is going to sound crazy, but read the physicists, not me. They will tell you that our theories of matter at the ordinary level, I'm not talking about dark matter and dark energy, is fully complete. Okay? The theory is called quantum field theory. And it simply rules out the soul. The theory is complete in the sense that it contains a theory of its own limits. So we would know what kinds of particles could or could not have been found. Again, go read what the physicists are saying. They're saying the soul is almost impossible for a good reason. They're not just making things up, right? They've spent their entire careers looking at things like that. So you could say about, if we go back to the days of Newton and Newtonian theory, classical physics does not contain in itself a theory of its own limits. And in the 20th century, relativity and quantum mechanics were developed. But quantum field theory does contain a theory of its own limits. And so you can make predictions about what we're likely to have found and not have found. And you can rule out the notion that the soul would be a tiny particle. Look at Brian Cox, for example. He's made the same claims. It's not just one physicist. There's agreement on this. So this basically rules out the idea.
Although I would say that they haven't done a lot of experiments on living human brains. Put them in particle accelerators or so on. They're extrapolating off of what happens in their
But they also know with very good levels of certainty that we're made up of the same fundamental stuff. There's no magical substance in the brain. We're made of stardust. We know where the molecules and the atoms that make us up came from. Right? We know exactly what the chemical composition of a human being is.
Of the brain is.
Of the entire body is. And there's no mystery part of it.
So, Professor Musolino.
Yeah, Julien, that's fine.
So, you mentioned how it's upsetting to the general public to hear this kind of information. So do you agree with the new atheist Richard Dawkins' St. Harris School of Thought that we should be actively addressing these issues head on?
I think that so, with regards to the new atheists, they have been criticized often for being too abrasive. And, you know, maybe they are, maybe they are not. What I think is important is that we be allowed to discuss these issues. They're very important. We are at a university. We must be able to talk about anything. You see that we're not fighting. We're doing this. We're doing this respectfully. We're doing this. We all know each other or on friendly terms. It is vital that we be able to talk about such questions, because the minute you start saying, "Let's not talk about this because it's too touchy" or whatever, you know what happens. The minute you start banning certain ideas, you know exactly what happens. Remember the 1930s when books were being burned because ideas were inconvenient? If you want to give up organized society and democracy, that's the first thing you do, is you start banning ideas. Because you say, ooh, it's too controversial, we can't talk about it, it hurts people's feelings. Nobody forced anyone to come here. We're not imposing this on people. It's a free thing that's open. People can come or not come if they want. If we want to live in an open, democratic society, we must be able to talk about ideas openly. And universities are one of the last bastions where this is possible. I mean, imagine, for example, being at a corporation and daring to criticize the CEO. Well, your job's not going to last very long. But here we can. We can criticize any authority figure. We can criticize any other scientist. We do this by playing the games, by playing by the rules. So that's very, very important that we be able to do that. Yes?
Oh, can I ask?
Yeah.
I understand this is coming from the perspective of like 3 different fields of thought, philosophical, psychological, and cognitive science. My question is that we all propose a question today, whether or not a soul exists. And it seems to me, within these 3 fields of study, we go in different directions. Starting, a little bit of a Cartesian dualism, you were talking about existentialism, you're talking about metaphysical problems. You're approaching it from a psychological perspective, surveying people, conducting experiments, seeing what they think, and then asking important physical questions. And then we went to the cognitive science route, whether talking about abductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. So my question is that, I guess it's for all 3 of you on the panel, is there a way that if we sat all you guys down together for a lunch, if we could, this is my question here, start from the same place when answering this question, because all 3 of you guys have different terms and conditions, and then we obviously end with 3 different, very different conclusions based on your fields of expertise. So I guess at the end of the day, is there any way, I guess, to make really good progress come together amongst the 3 different fields of study?
I'm happy to take this,
sure,
if you'd like, real quick. The field from which I spoke is not just, it is cognitive science, it is science in general. So we have to first make a decision. We have to first agree on what it is that we want to talk about. Okay, the question is the soul. The next step is, what kind of soul are we going to talk about? What I propose that we do is we talk about the soul that most people believe in. I think that's a fair thing to do. Then we ask, what kind of question is it? It turns out it's a scientific question. Then we answer it scientifically. Cognitive science is part of science. Right? So the arguments I gave are part of cognitive science. I gave arguments in the book about psychology and neuroscience. I just also happen to give arguments about physics and biology because it's about science more broadly. Now, philosophy is a different case, okay? They make different kinds of arguments, right? So, but to the extent that we agree on what people think the soul is, then to the extent that we recognize, I think as we should, that it's a scientific question, then it's a scientific game that we play. And again, I wish that I showed you this graph, but you might have the illusion here that there's a debate in the sciences. There's one guy who believes in the soul here, and there's a guy who doesn't. There's no debate in the sciences. You can look at all the papers you want in neuroscience, in linguistics, in psychology. Nobody talks about the soul. It's just gone. You won't find a published paper, or maybe it escaped the law somehow and got published, but in the overwhelming literature on neuroscience, let's put philosophy aside for a second. Right? Let's talk about the sciences. I'm not saying philosophy is not a science, but it's a little different. If we put philosophy aside, there's no discussion of the soul. You'll never find a paper saying, oh, by the way, the soul no, it's just gone. It's irrelevant to working scientists.
Because most of those things are about small, localized questions.
About what?
In published literature.
About what?
Small, localized questions.
Well, localized questions. I might have too long an answer for this. But I actually don't think any of us are making fundamental assumptions that are so different that we can't come to some rational consensus about this. I think the issues are really complicated. So I don't know, maybe we won't live long enough or talk long enough to. But I don't see either Mark or Julien making any really fundamental, just relying rock bottom on some fundamental assumption that I don't recognize myself. So I don't think it's that deep, the divisions. I could say more about science and consciousness, but we have too many questions. Maybe if it comes up with somebody else.
So one thing I was going to say too, we're coming up on time, but there's a lot of interest, so I think we should continue going with questions that folks want to
Yeah,
take
we have
off.
nothing to do.
Yeah.
I'll go. I teach
no, we
my
can
course
go
tomorrow morning
Happy
at
to stay and
9:30.
chat. Do we have the
Yeah,
room
we can
available
look
to
at
us?
that question.
Is the room available until? Oh, then
Yes,
we're good.
yes.
Then
So
we're
I
good.
think if we're going to go, I'd like to go.
What's your argument against closure? You argue that
What's my argument against what?
closure.
Cognitive closure?
Yeah, cats cannot understand that, so we cannot understand.
Yeah. The question for those who didn't hear it is, what's the argument against cognitive closure? And the answer is there's no argument against cognitive closure. Okay? If you adopt the conclusions of evolutionary biology that we're organic creatures, then of course we must have cognitive closure. So there must be, unless we're angels, which I don't think we are. So in fact, this would go against probably what Mark is saying. If we have immaterial souls that are magical, then why do we have closure? That's mysterious on this occasion. On the other hand, if we are organic creatures with a limit and scope, then of course we're going to have cognitive closure. Right? So there's no argument against it. The question is, what falls within the limits of our understanding and what falls outside? That's an empirical question. We have to decide ourselves by trying to understand stuff. What we used to think hundreds of years... So take Descartes, for example, and the soul. So Descartes said that his mechanical philosophy could not account for a certain set of phenomena. Suppose you had shown Descartes a GPS system. A system that can talk to you, tell you where to go, tell you how to turn right or left, knows where you are, knows where you want to go, can correct your mistakes. If Descartes had been honest with himself, he would have had to conclude that there was a soul in there.
I'm not sure I agree.
Oh, come on, of course. The thing can do all the things that he
What
said.
Descartes said, he talked about being able to, what impressed him was being able to talk in a free, unbounded way.
For the case of language,
GPS doesn't do that.
for the case of language, true, but there are other things that you attributed to the soul that GPS systems do now. So, oh yes.
Disagree.
Well, we can take a look at what Descartes said, but the point is that what was not understood. So here's something we will agree on. At the time of Descartes, the theories and ideas that give rise to GPS systems, including satellites in orbit around the sun that follows the law of general relativity, every now and again you have to feed them new time coordinates, were not understood by Descartes. Now we understand them, we've made progress. So you could have said back then, so if somebody in Descartes' time had said to you, what do you think it will ever be possible, forget about the soul for a second, to one day have a machine that can talk to you, tell you where to go, knows all the maps and everything. Somebody could have said, well, maybe not, maybe it's cognitive closure. Well, it turns out it wasn't cognitive closure. So what is and isn't cognitive closure is an empirical question, and you don't know ahead of time. You just don't know what we'll discover or not discover. So, are there limits to our understanding? If we're not angels, yes. Do we know what those limits are? No. We don't have a theory of that yet. So we just don't know. We just don't know.
This is for Professor Baker. Obviously we have a lot of very fundamental gaps in our understanding of how the mind works, things like abductive reasoning or conscious phenomena. But when you ascribe things that we don't know to some sort of immaterial soul, that sort of moves the discussion from a realm of scientific discussion where you can probe the problems and try and find some answer to a realm of very touchy religious topics that are best left alone. So do you feel like there's sort of it's slightly morally problematic to ascribe things to a soul and then kind of give up, be like, okay, well, it's a soul, let's move on, do something else?
Well, first of all, I don't think religious questions are so touchy that we shouldn't be able to talk about them too. Those could be on the table. It's come up here a couple of times. I mean, there are relationships between maybe questions about the existence of God and the existence of souls. They're not tightly intertwined, but they could have something to do with each other. Julien and I would agree about this, put it all on the table and talk about it all. There's, of course, if you're a dualist, there is the interaction issue about how does the soul interact with the body. And at least we could study it on the body side. And I wouldn't rule out the fact that we couldn't make some progress in our understanding of the soul side too. This is the whole question of cognitive closure again. Augustine, according to that, said, okay, souls are outside of what human beings can think about. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe somebody just hasn't had the good idea yet.
Hello everyone, my name is Jesus and I'm going to address my question to Mark. So basically it seems to me that the best piece of evidence that people who believe in an immaterial soul have is that when you ask somebody who believes so, they will tell you they have a strong feeling about it. Oh yeah, I feel like I have a soul. But if we go back to psychology, there's something we call misattribution of arousal, and that just shows you how people are faulty judges in what they're feeling, in what they're thinking. So if people indeed are faulty judges of what they're believing, feeling, and thinking, then how come is the best evidence that they have, oh, I feel to have a soul? So my question is, what evidence besides that one do we have that is an immaterial soul?
Well, that wasn't, the fact that most people think they have a soul, I did not use that in my argument. I maybe used it a little bit indirectly, saying, okay, implicitly versus sort of an Occam's razor thing, why should you believe in something you don't see? Well, if people already believe in that, maybe it's not such a leap to say this is what that does. But I didn't use that argument. I think it is relevant in some ways. So for example, Julien talks about in his book too, that it is true that we don't attribute the right motives to ourselves often. We confabulate a lot. And we say, oh, I did it for this reason, when we can say, no, that's not why you did that. That's a very interesting phenomenon, I think, and should give us all a little bit of humility. But I think it's one thing to say that this has more to do with the problem of free will, I think. It's one thing to say, okay, I was wrong about the motives of that particular action. That's true. Often we're wrong about our motives about that particular action. But to me, it's a huge non sequitur to say, therefore, there's no such thing as voluntary action. It's one thing to say, oh, I acted for this reason and I was wrong, I acted for that reason. It's another thing to throw out the whole explanatory apparatus of I acted for a reason. That I would not go to.
Thank you very much.
Okay, this is for Dr. Baker or anyone who really wants to answer. So, say that you come in contact with a person who's either like very mentally challenged or raised in isolation, like complete social isolation, staring at a blank wall, like throughout all of childhood development. And he has no abductive reasoning from lack of just experience, education, or social communication. This is like kind of a two-parter question. Does he not have a soul? I feel that you probably wouldn't say that he wouldn't have a soul, which means that this form of reasoning develops, and it's like in the memories and experiences and complex circuitry of the brain.
Right. So I said on one of my last slides, I would say that the brain is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a lot of the complicated stuff that we're talking about, including abductive reasoning. Yes, you need a brain in order to do it. My claim is you need a soul in order to do it too. And I would think my mother, the D thing. So, my mother is in advanced stages of dementia, and she only utters formulaic sentence fragments at this point. She doesn't give any evidence of abductive reasoning, but she did for the first 75 years of her life. So I would say that you need the brain and the soul both to be able to reason like that. And if the brain's not developed yet, as in the case you were talking about, or has been ruined, that can make it impossible to get that kind of evidence for a soul. It doesn't mean the soul isn't there, it just means you've lost your ability to detect it because your detector's gotten broken.
In that scenario, how would the soul manifest itself in that human? Or like say someone has no self-awareness or from just being raised in isolation.
In a severe case, it might not be able to be benefits.
Yeah, I'm just wondering a little bit about the relationship between consciousness and the soul, right? And I think if you want to take some like conceptual analysis of consciousness, I don't know, you do the same with the soul. So if you take a dualist perspective, right, there's maybe like 3 different kind of dualist positions you could accept. Is the soul then emergent from consciousness? Does consciousness supervene on the soul? Maybe you want to knock out the immortality condition of the soul and you just have the other two, then it seems like it's just consciousness, we just refer to it as something else, different linguistic term or whatever. So any thoughts?
Happy to take this one. So it is true that there is an aspect of consciousness that philosophers often call qualia, the inherently subjective aspect of experience that we just don't understand. So what scientists think they're confident about is that organized matter gives rise to conscious thought. That you need a brain, as Mark said, to do it. I think we know with a high level of confidence. How the brain does it, science says we don't know. And it should stop there. We just don't know. But that's when philosophy kicks in and derives all kinds of conclusions from the fact that we just don't know how it works. They start to think, well, could it be this, could it be that? Are there zombies? Are there philosophical zombies? There are people just like us that don't have qualia? And they derive all kinds of conclusions. I think this is where really philosophy and science part. Science simply says, look, we just don't understand, that's it. We understand access consciousness, so how information moves from being unconscious to conscious, but qualia, we don't even, in fact, some people think that qualia is not even a real problem. That's a false problem. There's not even agreement among philosophers on that. There are people who think that qualia is part of cognitive closure, that will never understand qualia. They're called the Mysterians. There are people who think that in philosophy, there are people who say, look, give us enough time and we'll understand it. And there are people like Dan Dennett, for example, who say it's a false problem. Scientists simply say, look, we just don't understand it, so that's all we can say about it. I think, honestly, we should say we don't understand it, and that's it. That's it. We just don't know how organized matter gives rise to the property of conscious thought. But that it does have that property, I think, has been clear, at least since the 18th century. Look, Newton was puzzled that organized matter has the property of gravity, which defies human intuitions. It flew in the face of what's called the mechanical philosophy, or contact mechanics. It is inconceivable intuitively to a human being that you can have action at a distance. Okay, well, that's called science now. We don't have to understand the intuitions as long as we have the right equations and make the right predictions. In the case of consciousness, we just don't understand. That's it. That's all we can say.
I know that, but I'm saying, I mean, there are pretty strong arguments for dualist positions, right? So if you're going to...
They're not scientific arguments,
No,
they're philosophical arguments.
Yeah, but those arguments, you would think maybe they have some worth, right? So I'm just saying, if you take those arguments, right, then where does the soul come in?
I don't know, because I don't take those arguments. That's a different game that people play. All I say is we don't understand how it works. So maybe Brian can tell you where it fits, but...
Well, I mean, you know, people have in mind many things by the soul, but philosophers tend nowadays to focus on consciousness. Marx sees a very intimate connection between consciousness and the soul. So I think most contemporary people talk about the soul, see a really intimate connection there. One thing we should be clear about is the idea. Somebody raised the question about fundamental assumptions and bringing in science. Notice I said that if general relativity theory is true, then what Descartes was saying doesn't make sense. Something can't be in time without being in space, because general relativity theory tells us if something's in time, it's in space, even if only at a point. And Mark accepts that. That's why the kind of dualism Mark was interested in is one where minds do, or souls do have spatial location. So there he defers to science. He's not challenging science. And in fact, I think if you could point out anything in physics that's incompatible, literally incompatible with Mark's position, that's well confirmed in physics, Mark, I bet, might be willing to give up the idea. There's nothing that's well confirmed in physics that's incompatible with there being something like a mental field or a kind of fundamental mental energy.
I would beg to differ strongly. You should talk to physicists. They've said this very clearly. All of modern physics is deeply incompatible with there being a mental field, a psi energy.
Let me tell you why it's not, okay? Take Schrodinger's equation, right? Schrodinger's equation in non-relativistic quantum mechanics functions analogously to the 3 laws of motions in Newtonian physics. The equation itself doesn't tell you what the causes of motion are. It places constraints on it. Just as Newton's 3 laws of motion don't tell you what causes motion, they just place constraints on it. What tells you what causes motion in Newtonian mechanics are the force laws. So you get the inverse laws like the law of gravity and Coulomb's law. In quantum mechanics, what plays the role of the forces are energies. But as you know, you can put Newtonian mechanics talk about Newtonian mechanics in terms of energy too. Likewise, you can talk about quantum mechanics in terms of forces rather than energy. The reason they do it with energies rather than forces in quantum mechanics is because energies are scalars and forces are vectors, and the mathematics are simpler. But when you solve Schrodinger's equation, one thing you have to do is solve for the Hamiltonian. The Hamiltonian talks about energies. And what they know is that it looks like you can explain chemical bonding. Looks like you can explain chemical bonding, for example, just by appeal to electrical energy. Right? They talk about electromagnetism just because of relativity theory. You know, whether the charges are moving or stationary makes a difference to whether you've got magnetism or electricity, electrostatic force. But whether something's moving or stationary is relative to a frame of reference, relativity theory. Schrodinger's equation itself can only be solved for the hydrogen atom, because if you move beyond the hydrogen atom, you get a 3-body problem. So what they do then is they make simplifying assumptions to apply it to more complicated cases. So the most innocent simplifying assumption they make is the Bohm-Oppenheimer hypothesis, where you assume that the nucleus doesn't move. Of course, the nucleus does move, right? But what they do have is existence proofs of solutions that Schrödinger equation has unique solutions for all the big molecules, for the 100 or so molecules. And they can use these various approximation and simplifying assumptions to explain things right up to sort of proton falling. But there's nothing incompatible with quantum mechanics. With it turning out to be the case, then when you get 1 billion neurons packed in something the size of a basketball interacting in various ways, you don't get a new fundamental kind of energy. There's absolutely nothing incompatible with quantum mechanics about that. Now, that they believe that's the case, most of them think we don't know. You know, some of them might think there's no reason to believe it. They tend to try to say, well, you know, let me put it in forces again, that looks like you just need these 4 fundamental forces and they might be unified there. But they'll be quite open with you and say, look, we don't know whether there are other kinds of fundamental forces. We don't know whether when matter becomes configured in a certain kind of complex way, boom, a new fundamental force has to come in. But most of them are betting that's not true. But you know, there's no incompatibility there. It wouldn't be quantum mechanics was mistaken if there turned out to be something like a force of will when you get 1 billion neurons crowded around the brain interacting with it. That would not falsify quantum mechanics, and they recognize that way. It's just that, you know, somebody like Julien would say, well, as of yet, we have no need of that hypothesis. You know, show me I need the hypothesis, and then I'll posit it. But yet we don't know. And it's fair enough, you know, nobody can show you need it. But it isn't like they can give you explanations of this stuff now without it. As I said, they can't get much beyond the folding of protein molecules. So they don't really know. There's no incompatibility.
Again, I would beg to differ. There's no incompatibility if you assume that the soul is somehow physical, maybe fine.
No, I'm talking about it being in space. I'm talking about just now. I'm talking about the kind of dualism Mark had in mind, where it's a kind of psychic energy.
Again, go read what the physicists are saying. I mean, with all due respect, go read, for example, a piece in Scientific American called "Physics and the Immortality of the Soul," where leading theoretical physicists will tell you that the idea is, I'm quoting, incompatible with what we know about science.
There's
Now,
nothing, immortality didn't come up. I didn't talk about immortality.
no, but I'm talking about something precise. I'm talking about the kind of soul that most people believe in. If you change the definition, then sure, all bets are off.
Yeah, I'm changing the definition.
Okay, all right. But
I'm talking about the kind of thing Mark had in mind.
okay, but if you take, again, I want to be clear, and don't take my word for it. Go read what the physicists are saying. If you take the kind of soul that people believe in, the kind of religious soul that people believe in, then yes, the physicists are telling us that it is incompatible with what we know about physics. In fact, it's incompatible with what we know about biology, too. We know from biology that there's a single origin to life, 3.5 billion years ago, and that then we had the process, a naturalistic process of evolution, right? That eventually, through a tree of life, 3.5 billion years later, led to all these species. This is understood as a physical process, okay? Now there's a physical chain that unifies us and all other living creatures all the way back to very simple life form 3.5 billion years ago. At what point in that chain did the soul get inserted in the mix, and for what reason? Was it Neanderthals? Was it Cro-Magnon?
30,000 years ago in the Great Leap Forward, documented in the anthropological record.
That's when you know the soul was placed in. Okay, that's wonderful.
Well, no,
but we just
serious,
but we don't know, Mark. We just don't know.
Well, but there's some relevant evidence. So
there's evidence that
listen for a second. So Julien talks about this in his book and about how if you look at the physical body, how it, 98% of our DNA is the same as chimp's DNA, and there's a whole lot of continuity. But when you look at issues of the mind, there are some serious quantum leaps forward in human beings. We have evidence of abductive reasoning, nothing else does. We have language, nothing else does. We make maps, nothing else does. New tools or so on. There is, there's evidence, I think there's evidence of a quantum leap which you can kind of date when it comes to things of the mind.
I agree there's evidence of changes, but that's not evidence of the soul. Look, spiders spin webs, and they're unique maybe in that sense, but we don't want to give them a soul for that reason. Of course we're unique in many ways. Right? Many organic creatures are unique in many ways. And I don't deny for a second, I agree with you, Mark, that a few tens of thousands of years ago, there was a radical change. Humans became behaviorally modern. But that doesn't tell you that a soul was added to the mix.
It's a possible theory.
Sure, but at that point you can say that anything goes then. Of course, anything goes then if you allow this possibility. Anything goes.
So I would say I think we should take one more question formally, and then I just want to let Ben kind of pack up. We can continue talking. We'll take one more formally question, and we can continue talking after. So who wants to be the one?
We have Bruce.
Bruce.
Well, Mark called me out earlier to comment if something got my attention on comments on computation. So in your presentation about computation deductive reasoning, I felt like there was sort of the implication that an algorithm is only going to provide you with output that's sort of deductively entailed by the input. Is that really what you intended to say? And that was sort of the crucial step in arguing against the ability to do abduction? Or?
I'm saying that we don't know of a mechanical system that can reason abductively.
Okay. So I think my programs do. So you can tell me where we disagree on abduction.
Okay.
So I write programs that model language learning in children. And quite often you'll be presented with a set of data, and out of a space of possible grammars, there are several consistent with the data. But some say, yes, you should get the data you see, and a variety of other forms as well, which are suspiciously absent in the data. And others would say, no, one grammar will say, no, you should see more than just what you've got in the data, but a lot of the suspicious absences shouldn't be just suspicious absences. The grammar shouldn't allow them. And the algorithm, in front of the simulation concludes that that's the grammar you want. And so that seems to me like abduction in the way you characterize it. It has multiple possibilities. It's reasoning to the best explanation. Now, is that fundamentally different in some sense from abduction as you see it?
Well, I guess I would guess, he's got the computer science degree, I don't. I would guess that this would be a case where, as I said, where you can make a semantic problem into a syntactic problem in some cases if you code it right, basically. If you come up with a representation where the semantic properties are done in the form. So I would say probably if you haven't reinvented computer architecture and come up with something that's beyond a Turing machine, that you've got something that looks like it's working abductively, but underneath it, it's working on the syntax of the representation, not on the meaning of the representation. But we may have to talk more. Do you think that's not right, or?
Well, I guess I don't see the difference between that instance and what one could, using that as a template, attempt in any other domain. It sounds more like a question of what principles you're assuming in your algorithm and how you structure the representations of the domain. That's how it sounds to me.
I suppose we would have to talk more to get to the bottom of that.
So you had something in mind with the frame problem? Is that what you
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
That's
so
another.
Do you have a way around the frame problem?
A way around the frame problem?
Yeah, frame. I think Mark was thinking of the frame problem.
So if you're saying, do I have an answer for how all domains are represented?
You don't have it everywhere,
and
but
so
maybe
forth.
you think you do in this particular domain.
Right, but then, I mean, I think, for instance, abductive reasoning is being sold quite short in this whole discussion. So another place that one sees it referred to a lot is in low-level vision, where, the eye is presented with a case where the incoming stimulus grossly underdetermined the actual interpretation, and there's reasoning to the best explanation is the way the vision scientists describe it. And this goes below human beings, you're talking macaque visual systems and so forth, which is why you can trick them and get...
Yeah, well, they have illusion. So it's usually the view is that there are evolutionarily internalized regularities. There's statistical regularities in the environment that get internalized through the process of evolution in the visual system, and that's how the problem gets constrained. So you turn, ill-posed problem into one that can be solved because they're very heavy-duty constraints. Yeah.
Right.
So you have something like constraints that you think we might have internalized or something?
That's what I would suggest. I mean, that's where the search would go at least, okay? There are domains that we think we understand and we see this kind of reasoning. So the place to look, if you were going to look for abduction elsewhere, would be to take other domains where we think something like abduction is going on and say, okay, what sorts of things would have to be true of the representations? What sorts of principles would have to be built in that would lead in this direction?
I suppose from what you said there too, it's not full-blown abduction in the sense that Fodor was relevant, because I suppose you are constraining by the way you set up the problem what kind of evidence is relevant to the stress system, right? You have sort of well-defined inputs and so on. And they're not going to realize, something about the syntactic structure of it that I never thought of before is relevant to the stress system.
If they're going to get it right,
self-contained in that way.
Right. And so I would say that the evidence that's appealed to towards things like science show that what people today think are relevant, people early on just missed all the time.
Right.
If the test of abductive reasoning is that it get what we sort of, at this stage, objectively think correct, no organism has ever exhibited abduction, because people arrive at wildly different generalizations and what they think is the explanation.
Right. Well, that's one of the challenges of the argument, to prove that people really can reason abductively. Not just look like they can in a limited thing, but they really can full-blown. That's one of the challenges of the argument.
So yeah, we can certainly keep going. I just don't want to make people to feel pressure, and we're just going to start cleaning up here. So we can go. You have a question?
For everyone, what do you think that we have to gain or lose from the loss of the soul? Like, why do we need one? Why don't we need one?
Well, if I'm right, if you lost your soul, you wouldn't be able to reason abductively, you wouldn't be conscious, you wouldn't be able to do voluntary actions for a purpose, and your sentences would have no meaning.
Pretty bleak.
Sorry.
That's fine.
But other than that.
Other than that, you're fine.
Other than that,
Yeah,
live it up.
you're good. On,
Go kill Sarah Connor.
don't kill Sarah Connor, right? On the consensus view in the sciences, what you would lose is immortality. And that's it. And you would lose a magical version of free will that we should want to lose anyway, so that's good. And you would gain a bunch of stuff. But you would lose essentially immortality, because there'd be nothing to carry your consciousness into the afterlife.
What do we gain?
Oh, we gain a lot, I think. So this is not going to take 30 seconds. So
Yeah, maybe hold that.
maybe I'll hold this thought then.
Yeah.
The last 2 chapters of his book tell you.
Pretty much, yeah, right. So.
I was going to say, actually, we probably should send some reading and follow-up on this too, that people might be interested in, because I think this conversation can continue clearly.
My question is for Julien. I agree with the rejection of dualism, but I'm not sure I agree with your suggestion of materialism. So
I didn't hear you. Not sure you agree with?
Sorry, I said I agree with the rejection of dualism, but I'm not sure I agree with your suggestion of materialism. So in adopting a metaphysical monism, why?
Oh no, I'm not. Hold on, I'm not adopting that at all. So remember, now you're moving to philosophy. We're talking science here. All I'm saying is that the materialistic hypothesis from the scientific perspective means that mind and body are not detachable. That's all. Now, that's a non-detachability that makes the materialistic claim true, I think. Now we can talk about what materialism is, but that's not a scientific question, that's a philosophical question.
Right, but isn't there a philosophical implication that what is fundamental is what is physical, and so whatever is mental is just derivative of the material? Like, isn't that
So
the material?
the implication is the following. So think of the following analogy. Imagine a music box, right? Okay. You crank up that little crank and then you start listening to music. If somebody were to ask you, where does the music come from? The answer would be, well, it comes from the physical operation, or let's not even say the word physical, it comes from the operation of the parts that you activate. So it's not independent from it.
I would object that music isn't a purely physical thing. Like, there has to be a subjective component of.
But forget about people now. Music is sound waves. We know that they're physical things. So, but by the way, what we mean by what I think we should do is we should drop notions like physical and non-physical. These are not scientific notions, by the way. We talk about them like this, but these are pre-scientific notions. Noam Chomsky made a very, very nice argument along those lines. He said, look, what's material? Well, in the time of Descartes, there was a very clear and coherent notion of what material is, an intuitive notion of what material is. It was what's defined by the contact mechanics of the time. And then whatever wasn't that was immaterial. What Newton showed is that our intuitive conception of what material is just basically falls apart. So what is material or physical is whatever physicists are telling us must exist for purposes of scientific explanation. So particles with no mass and stuff. Anytime you start understanding something and it's added to scientific theories, it becomes physical by definition. So I don't think materialism is a terribly interesting idea. It's just something we talk about when we talk about theories, but I don't think it has much content, right? It's not really a scientific thing, although people talk about it. What's material is whatever happens to be needed for the purpose of physical explanation. At the time of Descartes, for example, electromagnetism was not known. People could have said, if they heard about it, oh, it's immaterial. Nobody says it's immaterial now. Now it's physical because we understand it. Anything we understand becomes part of the physical world and part of science. Genes are physical or material because we understand them to some degree. Electromagnetism now is physical because it's part of physical theory. So all I was saying in the case of materialism, I'm not talking about anything metaphysical. So there's a distinction in philosophy between methodological naturalism and metaphysical naturalism. What methodological naturalism is simply science. You invoke whatever you need to invoke to explain the world. That's it. You don't make metaphysical claims about is it the only kind of stuff? Is there supernatural? We don't talk about this. philosophers worry about metaphysical stuff, like how we interpret scientific theories, what they mean for reality. Scientists don't bother much about this. They're just trying to explain how the world works. So what I am is a methodological naturalist. Am I claiming that the only things that exist are material? No. I'm open about it. But you got to tell me what you mean now by material and immaterial, right?
Okay.
I know it's a lot throwing at you.
Here's the way people tend to do it now. People used to say that if something's posited by physics, it's automatically physical. One of the problems with that is, take Descartes, for example. Descartes thought that if you were going to have a complete physics, you'd need a complete mechanics. Complete mechanics would give you a complete theory of motion. So you'd have to have all the fundamental causes of motion. He thought to do that, you had to posit a substance that doesn't exist in space. He was badly wrong, of course, but his view wasn't false a priori. I mean, it got refuted pretty early on empirical grounds. But on that notion of the physical, Descartes' immaterial substances are physical because he thought his physics had to posit them to explain motion. What people usually do now is if they try to give the notion of physicality some content, they tie it to not just current physics, because people think current physics certainly isn't completely right. There's still a tension between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. But something like an improved version of current physics that straightens out all the problems. That's very vague, so anything that would be posited by an improved version of current physics, they count as physical. That's very vague, of course, but it's hard to be more precise than that.
I should clarify. I'm not suggesting that I think that minds are non-physical. Merely what I'm suggesting is that there exists a distinction between physical and mental that is like, we can make real claims about bodies, and those are physical claims. And we can talk about things like math, which are abstract.
Math, you said?
Right, like
math, okay.
these abstract, what I think are purely mental things. Or maybe not purely mental, maybe there's just one thing and there's a physical aspect and a mental aspect to everything. But it seems like materialism would suggest that fundamentally everything is material and that what is mental, like math, simply arises from what is physical.
It
like
really
atoms.
depends what you mean by materialism. It depends. Again, it's not a question that scientists worry much about. They worry about trying to understand how things work. So there is in philosophy something called predicate dualism. And here's the idea. The idea is that to account for certain kinds of phenomena, you need different levels of analysis. Right? That's a very common theme in the sciences. It's not, you don't explain, for example, the behavior of chess players on the chessboard by using the rules of quantum mechanics. It's the wrong level of analysis. You invoke notions like pawn and bishop and castle, which are not part of the vocabulary of elementary physics, but are nonetheless needed at a higher level of analysis to account for the behavior of chess players. Right? So when we talk about mind now, as Jerry Fodor made this point, we are using a mental level, and we're using mental terms to account for a certain range of phenomena. But these are abstractions. They're not, so if you want to call abstractions immaterial, that's fine. So it's a bit like, take for example your passport and your nationality. Your passport is physical. You can see it, touch it, so it satisfies our intuitive notion of what physical is. Is your nationality physical? Well, you can say what your nationality is. It's an abstraction. It's an abstract way to talk about a property that you have. Let's say you're an American, right? But I don't think it helps to, so if we want to label things, fine. You want to label your nationality immaterial, great. But I don't think it helps explain anything. It's just a label we can give something. Right? So that's one, so we can call abstract things immaterial if we want, fine. I don't think what it does, I don't see what it does to explain anything.
Yeah, people usually don't tie it to abstraction. So, for example, Classical mathematics is used throughout all the sciences, not just physics, all the sciences, all the special sciences too. The foundations of classical mathematics are given by classical logic and set theory. Set theory talks about sets. Sets are abstract.
So Matt, I think we're actually going to start cleaning up the chairs. But I mean, I think this is a conversation that will continue and can continue.
Nope, I'm going home to bed.
And then we'll continue. I think we should have follow-up dialogue and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Brian, Julien, Mark, and of course Sarah for this extraordinary program tonight. One thing, I don't know if this is a materials or immaterial question, but if each of you can fold up a chair, carry it over, and hang it on the rack, this will aid our transition. Thank you very much.
So thanks so much. This is fun.